The past few weeks have been fraught with violence and unconscionable acts in the Middle East. Rockets have been fired, airstrikes have been called, and hundreds of people have been killed, mostly Palestinians. This conflict between Israel and Palestine has been painted as difficult to understand and full of details that third parties couldn't comprehend. However, with the recent escalation and the resulting coverage of what's going on, it seems as though we're better equipped to understand what's going on than previously implied. As more folks are forced out of their homes and with the civilian casualties rising, one has to wonder, what if Israel and Palestine united? To posit such a question does require a base understanding of the conflict currently playing out. We've recently put together a video that takes a deeper look at the history of Israeli-Palestinian relations, so make sure to check that out if you haven't already. A brief history would look something like this. Britain promised all sorts of different people ownership of Palestinian land, which eventually resulted in the UN handing a good deal of Palestine over to Zionist Jews, or Jewish people who believed that they needed a defensible homeland and the establishment of a Jewish nation. Wars broke out throughout the 20th century over land ownership, and eventually Israel took over a majority of the land in Palestine. What was supposed to be a 50-50 split became much more heavily skewed in Israel's favor, and plenty of Palestinian land was settled upon by Jewish people. The legality of these settlements has been contested, but that has not stopped the communities from building permanent structures. Walls have also been erected around these settlements, with the double effect of defending against protests while also claiming additional land. These land-based disputes have been the fuel behind a lot of attacks from both Israelis and Palestinians, especially when you consider that the holy city of Jerusalem remains hotly contested to this day. While the UN and plenty of other usually Western nations have acknowledged that Israelis deserve to have a homeland of their own, they have not really come up with a solution to this land being taken from Palestinians. A lot of the unrest we've seen lately seems to stem from Palestinians not wanting to cede land to Israel for free. The Israeli police crackdown at Al-Aqsa Mosque in early May was a response to protesters speaking out against Jewish settlers forcing Palestinians out of their homes. Hamas was not happy with how this played out and demanded that police withdraw from the mosque lest they fire rockets into Israel. Their demands were not met and rockets were fired. After that, a deadly back and forth began, with rockets and airstrikes being exchanged. Now, if you take a look at the amount of destruction on each side, there is a definite imbalance. During the chaos that ensued for 11 days after the initial attack, over 248 Palestinians were killed, including 66 children and thousands injured. During that same time frame, over 12 Israelis, including 2 children, were killed by Hamas rockets. Any loss of life is a tragedy, and the attacks from both sides should be condemned. However, Israel does have the definitive military advantage as both an aggressor and a defender. A ceasefire was called, and the UN urged strict adherence to the terms. All 15 UN Security Council members vetted the statement, mourning the loss of life and stressing the need for humanitarian help for Palestinian civilians, especially those in Gaza. The continued airstrikes upon the Strip resulted in medical facilities being unable to treat people, COVID testing centers needing to be shut down, and it also prevented civilians from accessing clean water, electricity, and internet connectivity. So while rockets fired by Hamas and other Palestinian groups did touch down in Israel, resulting in some deaths, the scale of the destruction and the aftermath are not on the same level. However, the UN continued on to say that they need to reiterate the importance of achieving a comprehensive peace based on the vision of a region where 2 democratic states live side by side in peace with secure and recognized borders. That is the vision from the international community for Israel and Palestine, which sounds lovely. However, it's hard to envision that coming to fruition, especially after years of borders being largely ignored and plenty of settlers erecting communities upon the land of others. Unity would require a permanent ceasefire, a promise to avoid further violence at all costs, and a stoppage of settler activities across the board. Is that possible? It's hard to say. With Gaza in shambles, it's unlikely that people living there will be able to start up their lives again anytime soon. Whereas in major Israeli population centers, such as in Tel Aviv, folks do have to be wary of rockets, but the disruption of life is nowhere near as severe. For that unity, Palestinian land would have to be more developed and their borders would have to be guaranteed. No more settlers ejecting people from their homes, no more land grabs, and no more airstrikes at a bare minimum. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has pledged $75 million in development and economic assistance to help Palestinians return to normal life in Gaza after the bombardment, which is a start. However, if we look at the monetary support the U.S. provides Israel on a yearly basis, it becomes apparent that the $75 million pledge is largely going to help repair damage that they have been causing. In 2020, the U.S. gave Israel $3.8 billion, mostly in the form of military assistance. They've been committed to aiding Israel since the 40s, and in doing so have provided plenty of cutting-edge military technology. Doing so has empowered Israel to uphold American values in the Middle East and allows them to defend themselves quite effectively. But this also allows Israel to cause plenty of destruction across the border in Palestine. So the $75 million pledge, along with $5.5 million in immediate disaster assistance and $32 million in aid for Palestinian refugees, seems more like a band-aid than a solution. Unity between Israel and Palestine might mean diverting more of these funds given to Israel and using them to cement a place for Palestinians to live without the threat of settlers or oppressive military rule. Otherwise, one group will always be stronger than the other, leading to more of what has already happened. Peace is a difficult thing to envision, especially after so many lives lost. The bombing of a tower that housed journalistic institutions in Gaza doesn't bode well for long-term unity either. But for a kind of reaching across the aisle to actually take place, the allies of Israel and Palestine need to reconsider how they approach their relationships. A two-state solution is the ideal option, but one can see why each side wouldn't be 100% committed to that. To prevent further bloodshed, though, one would hope that that might end up being the case. The thing is, a lot of what's happening isn't in the interest of civilians. The people who live in Israel and Palestine don't have much say as to what's going on. Folks just want to live their lives in peace, but are dragged into these conflicts by politicians and militaries. We can hope for a future where innocent people are no longer dragged into bloody shows of power, and where folks can live in their homes without fear of being forced out to make room for others. So, what do you think? Is there hope for unity in the near future, or will this be dragged on by those in power? Let me know your thoughts on the matter down in the comments. Speaking of comments, let's take a look at some of yours from What If Israel and Palestine Started World War III? S.J. Ferriol says, I just noticed if two nations get into war with each other, it can end up into a world war. Everything's connected these days. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Alex Hernandez says, it's possible World War III already began in 2019 with coronavirus. If coronavirus was a bioweapon, then World War III began as biological warfare. It's a little far-fetched, especially considering that it became a pandemic that affected the whole world, but we'll see how it all plays out over the next little while. And Serena Santiago says this just needs to stop. Innocent civilians are losing their lives over something they have nothing to do with. One has to hope that the leadership on both sides clues into this. And that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.